Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about the end times. More precisely, I would like to talk to you about the rapture of the church, the Christian doctrine to which Jesus will call all of those who truly believe in him and have called upon him to be their personal Lord and Savior up to safety, to spare them from the horrors of the Antichrist and the final judgment. This belief that Christians hold that at the end of the world they should be spared the ultimate and final wrath of God. Well, to be perfectly honest, the topic is going to be a little bit different than that. It's going to be about how it's not really something that Christians in general believe. It's something that specific Christians believe, and they are usually evangelicals or Pentecostals, although many Baptists have also embraced the rapture. And by that I mean on a denominational or congregational level, rather than on an individual level, because when you look at the rapture and how many people believe in it, it's hard to pin down exactly who does and doesn't. For instance, the United Methodist Church has taken no position on the rapture, meaning that from an official position they don't believe in the rapture, but they don't discourage belief in it either, and don't tell their members to not believe in it. Meaning, if you are a United Methodist, you can be a very strong, convinced believer in the rapture, but also be sharing a church with someone who isn't. In some cases, a United Methodist Church may have an entire congregation of rapture believers who preach it from the pulpit, but in general, the United Methodist Church just leaves that alone and leaves it to individual consciousness, and many United Methodists reject the rapture. And that's what makes the rapture a bit difficult, because if you really think about it and did a bit of study, you'd find that there are some churches that explicitly teach the rapture. There are other churches that don't teach the rapture but allow local congregations or local associations within their umbrella to do so. And there are some that take no official position on the rapture whatsoever, thus creating a situation in which some of the individual members believe in the rapture while others don't. Really, the only surefire way of determining it would be to look at the churches that explicitly mandate the rapture as a part of their core teachings, or to look at those who simply reject the rapture. Because those that take no official position, or that take the official position of allowing local groups to make their own determinations, are a little harder to understand. In fact, it's probably not even a uniform idea to look at a church's official teachings, because a church could officially denounce the rapture and still find individual members within it that accept it. They agree with most of what they church teach, but think the church is wrong on the rapture. Versus a group that does believe in the rapture, and people believe most of what this church teaches, but rejects the rapture as an individual. But I'm not counting those, because if you belong to a church that has its official doctrine the rapture, then while you as an individual don't, you're an outlier. Conversely, if you belong to a church that does not teach the rapture theory or even condemns it, you're an outlier if you do believe in it. But that's sort of the issue. The rapture has become rather ubiquitous in our modern English-speaking culture, especially in the United States. So much so that a lot of people have this odd assumption that the rapture is a universal Christian belief, or at the very least universal in Protestantism, with Protestantism being defined very broadly in a general level. For instance, I grew up in the Churches of Christ, not the United Church of Christ, the Churches of Christ, the ones that don't play piano or any form of musical instrument. the ones that insist on baptism being necessary for salvation, the ones that deny any church tradition or any theological belief that is not explicitly spelled out in the Bible. That group, having emerged from the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. And I can tell you from experience that the rapture is not taught within the churches of Christ. I know this because I had never heard of the rapture until I was in high school. Even though I had been attending church since I was born, even though I was immersed in a culture of Christianity, I had simply never heard of the rapture. Part of that, though, may be that the churches of Christ tend not to interact with other churches, and in my day-to-day life, religious beliefs didn't really come up that often. People would say things like, "I'll pray for you," or "God bless you," and things like that, but it's not like we sat down and had theological discussions. In fact, until the Left Behind book series was released, I don't think that many people were talking about the rapture outside of their churches on a regular basis. The Left Behind book series made it a popular topic of conversation outside of theological circles. Granted, it had its forerunners with people like Hal Lindsey and his best-selling book from the 70s, The Late Great Planet Earth, and the idea of the rapture in popular culture began to really grow exponentially in the mid to late 1970s to early 1980s. And the theory itself goes back to the 19th century with John Nelson Darby, and the Scofield Study Bible also made it rather common, but Darby and Scofield were still mostly limited to church talk. Sure, people do discuss theology outside of a formal church setting, but it's not the average topic of discussion, at least not when it comes to things like end times, or it wasn't until around the 1960s, 1970s range. But the Left Behind series did more than that. It gave us a story, and for some reason, once you tell a story, people tend to grasp the concept better. And in many ways, the Left Behind series popularized the rapture theory to a greater extent than even Hal Lindsey's best-selling novel, his best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth. But that doesn't change the fact that the rapture really, it's been around a while, but until Left Behind, it wasn't as much in the social consciousness. It may not be fair to say that. It had entered the social consciousness with Hal Lindsey, but it really stuck in people's minds once we started telling a story about it, because I think people can conceptualize things better with stories. I think that's why we tell them. Abstract ideas become more solid when you give them life by virtue of a story, be it a true story or fiction. So in a way, stories help cement ideas in people's heads, I believe. And I think that's why the rapture theory became more commonly known, but to be fair, it's been a steadily growing component of many churches' beliefs since at least the 19th century. It's just that it wasn't as ubiquitously talked about. But now it is so ubiquitous that people just assume if you're a Christian you believe it. Granted, not everyone makes this assumption. It's not a universal issue. But I have even had Christians come up to me, and finding out that I myself am a Christian, would ask if I'm pre, mid, or post-tribulation rapture, and I would have to tell them that I don't believe in the rapture at all. Which confuses them, because then they fall back on the, well, why not? It's in the Bible, isn't it? And the truth is, this channel is meant to be neutral, so I'm not trying to tell you what to believe, but even if we concede that the rapture is in the Bible, it isn't spelled out very plainly, and ultimately it's a matter of interpretation. It's not like there's a specific part of the Bible which elaborates and details the events of the rapture in order. Some may think that there's an entire book of the New Testament about the rapture. It's called the Book of Revelation, and that's not true. The Book of Revelation, while it is certainly true that many people who believe in the rapture look to it as outlining it, never gives the specific, well-known frame that you would have this event where millions would vanish, and then an Antichrist takes over, and there's a 7-year... None of that is spelled out in detail in the Book of Revelation and laid out like we thought. And in fact, most people who believe in the rapture of the church base it on passages in Daniel and in Thessalonians more than they do on the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation in popular imagination is that dark, mysterious prophecy book about the end of the world, so I suppose since the rapture deals with that, it's natural to make that assumption, but it isn't the reality. The reality is that most of the rapture's references come from other books. There are a few in Revelation, but most aren't, and that's what makes the rapture something that one can easily say isn't in the Bible, because in order to find the rapture in the Bible, you basically have to start with understanding the rapture theory ahead of time and reading into certain verses the rapture belief. And it is my belief that the first people who cooked up the rapture were working from a narrative they already had in their minds, maybe not the fully fleshed out rapture that we have today, and simply found verses and connected them together. But ultimately I view them as disparate. And again, I'm not trying to tell you if you believe in the rapture you're wrong. This channel is neutral, and I understand that there are arguments for it, but I'm just simply explaining my position about it. I don't believe in the rapture of the church. In my years as a person who went to the churches of Christ, I would have no reason to. And even while studying with Anglicans instead, the Anglicans don't believe in the rapture either, and neither do the Catholics. In fact, most of the older traditional Protestant churches don't accept the rapture, while some of the more modern evangelical Lutherans have embraced it, or at the very least, like the United Methodist Church, have remained neutral on it. Most Protestant denominations that we would consider mainline or of the older traditional orders don't really teach it and actually contradict it. And yet, I've had atheists tell me how silly I was for believing in the rapture, but I don't, or who have asked me to explain the rapture and why I believe in it, which is silly because I don't believe in the rapture and thus don't believe in it, and things like that. We tend to believe in the rapture as a uniform thing all Christians believe. And it's sort of interesting that we believe that, because when I try and explain what it is exactly that I believe, this acts as a bit of a stumbling block. For example, and in this case, I actually don't blame the militant atheists. I do blame them on how they present the argument, their lack of research into certain things, and their refusal to accept what I have to say about it, but I don't blame them for the argument itself. And it is precisely because of dispensational theology that I can't really blame them, or rather because of the ubiquitousness of it in contemporary popular culture. I shan't go into detail about it. I've done a video in the past about it and will in the future, but suffice to say, they take a verse from either Matthew or Luke where Jesus is asked when the sign of his coming will be, and when his kingdom will be established. In Luke it's the kingdom, but that's beside the point. And he gives a rather long story about wars and rumors of wars and what have you. And he says, this generation shall not pass until they see these things come to pass, and they see me come in my glory, or they see me, or they see the kingdom, something along those lines. In dispensational theology, we are currently in the church age. But after the church age ends, there will be a tribulation, and then Jesus will come back and set up his kingdom. And the atheists point to this verse and say, well, Jesus said this generation, and this generation means this generation. That means the people he was speaking to today, but they're all dead, so it's a false prophecy. But what they don't seem to understand is the traditional Christian understanding was not that we're in the church age, and that at the second coming of Christ, Jesus will set up his kingdom on earth, and that the kingdom of Christ isn't here yet. The traditional understanding is that the church is the kingdom. And the church did turn up during that generation, so it's not a very compelling argument to brand this a false prophecy under the assumption that since Jesus' kingdom isn't here on earth now because the second coming hasn't happened, this is a false prophecy. And yet I've had atheists insist that this must be what I believe when it's not, or claim that the theology I'm giving them, which is the traditional Christian understanding, is somehow an excuse to get around this. But the reason the atheists even know about this is because of dispensational theology and the rapture of the church. The atheists need to learn that not everyone makes that same assumption, but while most of them realize not everyone believes in the rapture, most of them still think that Christians are waiting for the kingdom of Christ, when that simply isn't the case. However, this video isn't about them, it's about the rapture, and what I find interesting about it. The rapture of the church is one of those odd things in theological circles, in that it is vastly more popular to laymen than it is to theologians, and it is one of the best known Christian theological concepts, so much so that many believe it to be a central teaching of Christianity, even though it's not. And that's sort of the issue that I have with the rapture. It's something that, since this channel is neutral, I'm not going to flat say is wrong. But I will say that the majority of Christians globally don't believe in it. It is not a historical Christian teaching, and in the end, it isn't clearly spelled out in the Bible. And yet, people believe that this is what Christians believe. And I've even had some Christians being baffled about why I didn't. It's an odd sort of thing, the rapture. But is it any different than other assumptions that people make? Oh, you're an American. Well, I suppose that means you love hamburgers and football. Oh, you're a woman. You must love chocolate. Hey, you're a black guy. I bet you really love rap and hip-hop. You're from the South. You must really love your country music. Sometimes I wonder why people need these childish, oversimplified stereotypes. But I realize they came to us for a reason. Racist stereotypes came largely from the way races were treated historically, for example, and interactions with them. And in some cases there were people who fulfilled some of those stereotypes. But the real story is always more complex. For instance, you may meet a lot of black people and they don't seem very smart, but it could simply be because they're not educated, and they may not be educated because of the circumstances they grew up in. And it had nothing to do with their actual intelligence. You may meet someone from the South who doesn't like country music. It was never their thing. But plenty of people in the South do love country music. But when it comes to the rapture, there's a little more to it, because it's not about what you like. It's about what you are, what you believe. It's about what Christians believe. Or if you broaden it, it's about what Jews believe, what Muslims believe, what Hindus believe, and how we often learn a very small aspects of a religion before judging it. It's very popular, especially online for instance, to point out that the Quran teaches us to be a terrorist, and that being a good Muslim means embracing terrorism. But the people making those claims only know out of context Quran verses and don't really know how Muslims have read the Quran, or of different groups of Muslims. In fact, they treat Muslims much the same way militant atheists treat Christians. Christians will often treat Muslims the same way that militant atheists treat Christians, assuming that there is this one unified Islamic religion and all Muslims agree and have the same interpretations. And it's idiotic. And yet we do it. I don't have much else to say right now, so I'm going to let you go. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.